For some of you, we haven't had a chance to converse since February. I think February is the last time that I did a presentation for the JCC. So it's good to be back. And for today and the next 3 Thursdays in May after this, we'll be looking at the topic of isolationism versus internationalism in US foreign policy. And so let me begin by reminding you that in his inaugural address on January 20th, 2017, Donald Trump declared, quote, "From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first." And during his 4 years as president, he questioned the value of the nation's core alliances. He cut back on immigration. He canceled trade pacts. He withdrew the United States from multiple international agreements, such as the Paris Climate Accord and the Iranian nuclear deal. He canceled free trade deals with our Pacific and Atlantic partners. And also, he raised tariffs on imported goods. So all of that was in line with his policy of America first. He responded to the COVID pandemic by going it alone, shunning international teamwork, turning our back on the World Health Organization. And so Trump's isolationist, unilateralist, protectionist, and anti-immigrant policies, these marked a sharp contrast with America's international agreements in the decades after the end of World War II. In fact, over the past 80 years, the United States has taken on a variety of international responsibilities and commitments. America has tried to run the world through a global network of international institutions, military bases, as well as alliances. However, Trump's go-it-alone impulse is really nothing new in American history. It resonates with American foreign policy before World War II, when the United States strictly adhered to a strategy of isolationism, when we shunned alliances and avoided any international commitments. So these 4 lectures will examine the history of American foreign policy through the lens of internationalism versus isolationism. Specifically, the lectures will address how American foreign policy followed an isolationist course at certain times and an internationalist course at other times in our history. The presentations will also focus on the reasons why we were isolationist at times and internationalist at other times, and what the consequences were for those policies. And finally, we are going to take a look at why isolationist sentiment is once again popular today, and the implications for that for both America and the world. Before we begin, I think it's advisable to define what we mean by isolationism and internationalism, and how these terms will be used in these lectures. The Oxford Language Dictionary defines isolationism as a policy of remaining apart from the affairs or interests of other groups, especially political affairs of other countries. And so, for example, in the 1930s, some Americans went out to demonstrate to prevent America from getting involved in foreign entanglements. In the American context, a policy of isolationism is based on the assumption that the problems of the United States become worse if we are engaged with other nations. And therefore, it is the best policy to follow by being disconnected with other nations. Isolationists argue that Isolationism allows the United States to devote all of its resources and efforts to its own advancement by remaining at peace and avoiding binding responsibilities to other nations. This is what Trump meant when he said, America first. Internationalism, on the other hand, is a policy that advocates cooperation among nations to cooperation for the common good of those nations. And so this could be economic cooperation, it could be political cooperation, it could be cooperation in dealing with environmental problems. In the American context, a policy of internationalism is based on the assumption that the problems of the United States become worse if we are not engaged with other nations. In recent times, internationalism has taken on a new meaning in which the United States sometimes assumes the role of policeman of the world. So to set the framework for this analysis, it's necessary to examine two related concepts underpinning American foreign policy since the very inception of this nation. And those two underpinning concepts are American exceptionalism and the sense of mission. What does it mean to say that America is exceptional? If it just means that America is unique, then that claim is unexceptional because no two countries are exactly alike. If American exceptionalism just means that Americans believe that the country is special, then there's nothing exceptional about this. Patriotism is universal. Many nations regard themselves as superior to other nations. The ancient Hebrews were convinced that they were God's chosen people. For centuries, the Chinese believed their empire occupied the middle of the earth and that China was surrounded by barbarians. Some people believe the term American exceptionalism means that America is under some divine dispensation that exempts it from the laws that govern other nations. And that provoked the German diplomat Otto von Bismarck to quip, God has a special providence for fools, drunks, and the United States of America. Now, the term American exceptionalism didn't even exist until the 20th century. No Puritan colonist, no founding patriot, no Civil War statesman ever used the term American exceptionalism. Not until 1835 did a foreigner, Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman, connect Americans with the term exceptional. He wrote in his book, Democracy in America, that the position of the Americans is therefore quite exceptional, and it may be believed that no democratic people will ever be placed in a similar one. Note, however, that de Tocqueville applied the term to America's position rather than to the American people themselves. The term exceptionalism was not revived until 1929, and it was revived by none other than the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. When he heard a report by the American Communist Party that workers in the United States were not ready for a revolution, Stalin denounced, quote, the heresy of American exceptionalism. So what exactly does American exceptionalism mean? Well, it refers to the theory that the United States is inherently different from other countries. First and foremost, inherent in American exceptionalism is the belief that the United States is a special nation with a special role to play in human history. The term is commonly used to describe the belief that the United States is not only an extraordinary nation, but also a unique and superior country. Many scholars believe American exceptionalism forms one of the core elements of America's national identity and a core element of American nationalism. There are four key components underlying this concept of American exceptionalism. The first is that the United States is the promised land and its citizens are the chosen people. Now, what does that mean? Well, it refers to the assumption that America is divinely mandated by God with the task of reforming themselves and the world. That, in other words, that the United States is a redeemer nation. That is, God intended the United States to redeem the world. That the intentions of Americans are good and that they will strive to build a civilization that will serve as a model for all the world is another foundation behind American exceptionalism. Another element is that America's separateness from Europe implies that America is better than Europe, that the new world is superior to the old world. Unlike Europe, America did not have any feudal traditions, such as an established church or a landed aristocracy. In Europe, Americans believed selfish monarchs exploited their people, then sought imperial expansion abroad to increase their power. The European political systems, Americans felt, was invariably corrupt. It left little or no opportunity for commoners to improve their lot in life. Whereas in contrast, America was committed to freedom and the betterment of humankind. The third main element behind exceptionalism is the belief that America is the leader of progress throughout the world. That practically everything that the United States does as a nation is done to push forward the boundaries of human achievement, whether in politics, industry, technology, sports, the arts, or warfare. The fourth component of American exceptionalism maintains that America always acts benevolently in its relations with other nations, that we act out of dedication to the principles of liberty and freedom for humankind. A corollary of this belief is that it's the duty of the United States to help the rest of the world follow our example. And most Americans seem to agree with these propositions. From the days of the American Revolution up till today, the idea that the United States is different from and superior to any place else on earth has become an article of faith for many Americans. In 1776, Thomas Paine, in his pamphlet Common Sense, expressed the belief that America was not just an extension of Europe, but it was a new land, a country of nearly unlimited potential and opportunity that had outgrown the British mother country. Thomas Paine described America as a beacon of liberty to the rest of the world. And more than 2 centuries later, President Ronald Reagan imbued his public pronouncements with exceptionalist symbolism and imagery. He described the United States as a shining city on a hill, a land of hope, a light unto other nations. And in the 2012 presidential election, candidate Barack Obama proclaimed that the United States has been and always will be the one indispensable nation in world affairs. And Donald Trump, in his 2020 State of the Union address, declared, "Our ancestors built the most exceptional republic ever to exist in all human history." It might as well be our national anthem, America the Exceptional. The concept of America as an exceptional entity can be traced back to the earliest colonial times, to America's Puritan roots. Many Puritans believed that God had made a covenant with, with them and had chosen them to lead other nations on earth. In the year 1630, the Puritan leader John Winthrop metaphorically expressed this idea as a city upon a hill, that the Puritan community of New England should serve as a model community for the rest of the world. And that metaphor is often used by proponents of exceptionalism, that America should be a shining city upon a hill, a model for other countries to emulate. Early Americans regarded the young country as the new Israel, a chosen nation whose mission it was to elevate mankind. And so the idea of American exceptionalism is a doctrine that maintains that the United States represents a unique experiment in political and economic liberty, and that it is destined and ordained to share that with the rest of the world. American exceptionalism also serves as the ideological foundation of the nation's ambitious global role. But paradoxically, from the founding era to the end of the 19th century, American exceptionalism served as the ideological foundation for not internationalism, but for isolationism. Proponents were convinced that we could be a city on a hill only if we could shield ourselves from the corruption and inequality of the old world, that we could save the world through example, not through domination, that the American experiment had to be sheltered from the danger of foreign entanglement. And so the doctrine of American exceptionalism fit in with the policy of isolationism. In the early years of the American Republic, there was widespread fear that engaging with other nations might threaten our national security, that if we were to ally with one or more European countries, that might drag us into European wars. Also, there was the fear that foreigners might try to interfere with American politics at home. So let us take a look at the origins of isolationism. Isolationism in America was made possible in large part because of our geographic position. Unlike other nations that are in close proximity with neighboring countries, the United States is protected by two vast oceans, the Atlantic Ocean on our east coast and the Pacific on the west coast. The United States was also blessed with only two countries on its borders, both friendly and relatively weak. Thus, throughout most of its history, the United States has been insulated from rivalry among the great powers. And isolationism therefore reinforced America's geographic invulnerability. From its start, the United States was a commercial nation. It was intent on maximizing foreign trade. And isolationism served commercial interests because it helped to avoid any embroilment with other countries. Simply put, enemies would be bad for business. And so it was in America's commercial interests not to become entangled politically with other countries. As Thomas Jefferson succinctly said, commerce with all nations, but alliance with none should be our motto. In addition to economic motives for isolationism, there was a racial motive as well. Many Americans considered their Anglo-Saxon roots as a source of the exceptional character of the nation. And many Americans felt that foreign adventures and immigration might dilute the country's racial homogeneity. That is, that if we welcome foreigners, they might then intermarry, and that would be damaging to the superior Anglo-Saxon blood that ran through the veins of many Americans. It was assumed by those Americans. And so here, this cartoon showing Anglo-Saxons turning back immigrants. So prior to the end of the 19th century, isolationism served as a cause for America's sense of racial superiority. The origin of the isolationist impulse dates back to the colonial period. Even before the colonists sailed from Europe, they really had been isolationist in spirit. The long voyage across the Atlantic took from 1 to 3 months, and it made colonists realize that they were separate from Europe in both space and time. And the longer they stayed on this side of the Atlantic, the less European they became. The colonists underwent a transformation that widened the gulf between them and Europeans. And a prime reason why settlers came to the New World was to escape the wars that regularly erupted in Europe. So, for example, at the end of the 17th century, the War of the Grand Alliance pitted France against England, the Netherlands, and Austria. In the first decade of the 18th century, Sweden fought Russia in the Great Northern War. And the War of the Spanish Succession in 1700 involved France, England, Prussia, Austria, and the Netherlands. And from 1756 to 1763, the 7 Years' War. This war drew the 13 colonies into a conflict with European nations. The 7 Years' War was largely fought between Britain and France, although it involved other nations as well. It was fought on 3 continents, in Europe, Asia, and North America. The 7 Years' War in North America was called the French and Indian War. In this conflict, American colonists fought alongside their British compatriots against a mixed force of French soldiers and their Native American allies. The colonists and the British were victorious in the French and Indian War. But that conflict impressed upon Americans the danger that came with political connections to Europe. The war was very costly for the victorious British. And in order to help pay for the war, the British imposed harsh taxes on the colonies to defray the cost of the war. And those taxes led Americans to resent British rule and ultimately to revolt against the British. The British also left a sizable contingent of troops west of the Appalachian Mountains in order to block the colonists from expanding westward, because if the colonists did expand west of the Appalachian Mountains, then they would come in conflict with Native Americans. And Britain would then have to protect the colonists, which again would be expensive. And so the British wanted to contain the colonists east of the Appalachian Mountains, which the colonists resented. Another reason why Americans wanted to separate from Britain was that the victory in the 7 Years' War ended the French threat in North America. And so after that, the colonists felt they no longer needed the protection of Great Britain. Now, the founding fathers came of age during the French and Indian War, and it made them very wary of getting into future conflicts with European nations. Thomas Paine wrote in Common Sense that it was not in the interest of the United States to become involved in the tangled relationships of Great Britain and the European continent. And so Thomas Paine said, it is the true interest of America to steer clear of European contentions. Other founding fathers agreed. In 1775, John Adams said, we ought to lay it down as a first principle and maxim never to be forgotten, to maintain an entire neutrality in all future wars. And in 1776, Adams wrote that America should make no treaty of alliance with any European power, but that we should separate ourselves from all European politics and wars. So clearly, the founding fathers did not want the new nation to get embroiled in European wars. But in addition to fighting for independence from Britain, the founders also wanted America to be dominant in the Western Hemisphere. Jefferson, for example, wanted the United States to, quote, cover the whole northern, if not southern continent. In negotiating with Britain to end the Revolutionary War, a major American aim was to get the British to hand over Canada, which the British refused. Even as the founders envisioned dominance in its own hemisphere, they were determined to remain isolated from the rest of the world. But during the Revolutionary War, American leaders realized they needed foreign help if they were to defeat the British. And so in 1778, they concluded a military alliance with France. And it was only with French assistance that they were able to defeat Britain and attain independence. But that alliance with France also enmeshed Americans in European rivalries, something that they very much wanted to avoid. The twin goals of isolationism and America serving a redemptive mission carried over into the period of the American Revolution and into the years following independence. After independence, the first government that was formed in the United States was called the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, each of the 13 states were almost independent of each other. In fact, each state had the right to form alliances with other countries. Well, there were many Americans who were concerned about this. And so to remedy that, it was decided to call a constitutional convention to revise the Articles of Confederation and to create a strong central government that would control foreign policy rather than leaving it up to each state. And in the Constitutional Convention, once again, the framers agreed that the United States should steer clear of foreign commitments. Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist No. 7, America, if not connected at all or only by the feeble tie of a simple league, offensive and defensive, would by the operation of such jarring alliances be gradually entangled in all the pernicious labyrinths of European politics and wars. In other words, that it was in the best interest of the United States to avoid European connections. But isolationism didn't dampen the general conviction that the new nation was destined to fulfill a providential mission. Many Americans interpreted victory over Britain in the War of Independence as proof of God's blessing. And Jefferson proposed as a national seal for the new nation an image of the children of Israel being led by a heavenly pillar of light. So this is the seal that Jefferson proposed. Americans as the children of Israel being led by, in this case, Moses, towards a heavenly pillar of light. This reinforces this theme of America as a chosen nation. Now, a policy of isolationism didn't mean that the United States would have nothing to do with other countries. In fact, during the 8 years of George Washington's administration, the nation's top diplomatic priority was to expand trade with other countries. But because the young nation was very weak militarily, it could not afford to make enemies. And so we were determined to avoid any political entanglements that might lead to conflict with other countries. But again, the new nation was hardly free of its connection with Europe. So, for example, Spain still had possession of Florida. And British troops remained in forts in the Northwest Territory to prevent Americans from expanding west of the Mississippi. And the 1778 alliance with France remained in effect. And all of that threatened to engulf America into European politics and European rivalries. The French Revolution of 1789, which put an end to the monarchy and ultimately led to the rise of Napoleon, all of that complicated things for Americans. In 1793, France once again found itself at war with Britain, and France called upon America to live up to the terms of the 1778 alliance and join with France against Britain. Now, that left the United States with a difficult strategic choice. If we did join France in its battle with Britain, that would endanger the American nation because we were very weak at that time. If we were to reject France's appeal, that would violate our treaty obligation to France. This situation was also politically divisive at home. Alexander Hamilton and his followers wanted to annul the alliance. They argued that the 1778 treaty had been made with the French monarch, and that since there was no monarch after the French Revolution, then we had no obligation to support the French revolutionary government in 1793. The French had beheaded Louis XVI, and so France was no longer under a monarchy. But Thomas Jefferson and his political allies maintained that the 1778 alliance was not with the French king, but rather with the French nation. And therefore, when France called upon us to live up to our obligations in that alliance, according to Jefferson, we should have, since that alliance was made with the French nation. It was up to President Washington to decide what to do. Washington deplored the divisions of public opinion in America regarding the European war. But Washington felt it was suicidal for the young republic to become involved in the European conflict. So he sided with Hamilton. And in 1793, he declared that the United States would remain neutral in the war between Britain and France. Jefferson protested this proclamation of neutrality. Jefferson wanted the United States to support France. And in protest, he resigned his position as Secretary of State in Washington's cabinet. Washington's proclamation of neutrality also angered France. The new French minister to the United States, Edmond Genet, he was called Citizen Genet, he recruited Americans to fight the British, and he outfitted ships in American ports to fight against British ships. He even threatened to instigate an American uprising against Washington if the president hampered his efforts. In turn, Washington demanded that France recall Genet. Despite Washington's decision for neutrality, relations with Britain also remained troubled. The British still maintained military outposts on US territories that you can see here on this map. And British ships intercepted American ships that were bound for French ports. The British seized the cargo of American ships headed to France. So to resolve these issues with Britain, the United States sent Chief Justice John Jay in 1794 to negotiate with Britain. And the result was something called the Jay Treaty of 1794. According to this treaty, Britain agreed to withdraw from forts on US territory. In turn, the United States agreed to pay debts that Americans owed to Britain before the Revolutionary War. But this treaty also said that Britain would pay for any damages that resulted from the seizure of American ships. However, Britain did not pledge to refrain from interfering with American ships in the future. Now, pro-French Jeffersonians were outraged with this treaty between the United States and Britain. Mobs gathered to hang John Jay in effigy in protest to that treaty. The Jay Treaty also led France to interfere with American ships headed to Britain. And in 1796, France broke off diplomatic relations with the United States. All of this serves as a background to Washington's farewell address in September of 1796. The farewell address is one of the most significant declarations in the history of American foreign policy. In that speech, Washington established policy goals that would be followed by American presidents for the next 121 years. So let's delve in detail into what Washington said in this famous address of 1796. The presidential campaign of 1796 had been dominated by bitter partisan disputes between pro-British Federalists and pro-French Democratic Republicans. The two parties disagreed over the proclamation of neutrality and over the Jay Treaty. Federalists supported the proclamation of neutrality and the Jay Treaty, whereas the Democratic Republicans opposed it. And the two parties also disagreed over whether the United States should honor its treaty of alliance with France. Washington, who had served 2 terms as president, was unwilling to run for a 3rd term. And so, in the summer of 1796, he decided that before leaving office, he would share his hopes and fears with the American people. His farewell address reflected his concern over the 2 major threats to the peace and security of the nation: partisan rivalry and foreign entanglements. And the address also re-emphasized the themes of American exceptionalism and America's redemptive mission. Washington began by reminding Americans that they had been blessed by union, freedom, and a democratic constitution, all of which made the United States exceptional among the world's countries. He went on to call on the nation to serve as a model for the rest of the world. He said, recommending America's blessings to the applause, the affection, and adoption of every nation which is yet a stranger to it. So other countries should adopt the political system of America. He then pointed out that America was exceptional not just in a political sense, but also geographically, when he said America was exceptional due to its detached and distant situation, meaning its distant situation from Europe and other countries. He then went on to say, why forego the advantage of so peculiar a situation? Why quit our own to stand on foreign ground? He went on to warn against party rivalry as a threat to national unity. He said the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, is itself a frightening despotism. And he said that factional strife opens the door to foreign influence, such as when France sent foreign agents to America in 1796 to convince voters to cast their ballots for Jefferson rather than for the pro-British John Adams. That's somewhat akin to Russian trolls favoring Trump over Hillary Clinton in 2016 and over Biden in 2020. Then President Washington got to the heart of his message when he said, "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is extending our commercial relations, but to have with them as little political connection as possible." In other words, trade, yes. Alliances, no. With the 1778 treaty with France in mind, Washington said, "So far as we already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here, let us stop." And again, referring to that alliance, he said, "We may safely trust to temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies." He was implying that the 1778 treaty with France was only temporary, but that really wasn't the case. Now, why shouldn't the United States make alliances with other countries? Well, Washington explained, Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have none or a very remote relation. Hence, Europe, must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Clearly, he was referring to the war between Britain and France at that time. Washington went on to state, "Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of Europe's politics or the ordinary combinations and collisions of her friendships or enmities." In other words, the United States should follow a grand strategy of isolationism, particularly with regard to Europe. And if his isolationist message wasn't clear enough, he ended the address by stating flatly, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." And from that time, 1776, until the United States allied with Britain and France in 1917 in World War I, every American president followed Washington's advice by refraining from alliances with other countries. So, to summarize Washington's farewell address, it struck themes that had been prevalent in the earlier history of the United States, that America should serve as a model for the rest of the world, that America was exceptional, that hostilities between political parties threatened the nation, and that we should trade with other countries but have no political connections to them. Now, John Adams was elected president in 1796, and France continued to interfere with American shipping. And so Adams sent representatives to negotiate an end to tensions between the United States and France. The Americans who were sent to France were met by 3 French agents. Hold on just one second. I've got to do something about this PowerPoint. Just one second here. Okay, for some reason, I'm not able to continue with the PowerPoint. I'm sorry about that. Give me a second here. I'll see if I could revive it.
Do you want to send it to me and maybe I can get it going?
Let's see. No, I don't think that's going to be possible, Jerry. So I'm going to have to, let's see. I'm afraid I'm going to have to continue without the PowerPoint. Let's see. Yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. So Adams sent 3 representatives to negotiate with the French. They were met by 3 French agents who remained anonymous. They were called X, Y, and Z. And they demanded from the United States a $250,000 bribe before negotiations could begin. And the United States was offended. And there was a wave of patriotic fervor that swept the country against France. The phrase "millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute" was raised in opposition to the French demanding a bribe. And that prompted Hamilton and other Federalists to demand that the United States should declare war on France. War fever against France reached the point that even pacifist Quakers favored going to war with France. Federalist newspapers added fire to the fuel by publishing anti-French propaganda. Congress appropriated funds to build warships to fight France. They created the Department of the Navy, which was authorized to attack armed French vessels. All trade with France was suspended. And Congress declared the Treaty of 1778 with France null and void. This undeclared war with France was called a quasi-war. It lasted 2.5 years, during which time the US Navy captured 80 French ships. And George Washington was even summoned from retirement to raise an army of 10,000 men. It seemed that the young American nation would abandon isolationism to go to war with France. But President Adams kept a level head, and he resisted the demand for war against France. From the outset, he sought a peaceful solution. He displayed extraordinary courage because he had to stand up to leaders of his own Federalist Party, including Hamilton. And Adams knew that that might cost him the election in 1800. But he believed that the American economy and the American government would collapse if the country became involved in a war with France. And so he diffused the crisis, and he improved relations with France through negotiations. Representatives from the United States and France signed the Treaty of Morte-Fontaine, which ended naval hostilities between the 2 countries and which terminated the 1778 alliance. Later, Adams wrote that avoiding war with France was one thing he would like to be remembered for more than anything else. If the United States had gone to war against France, it's doubtful that Napoleon would have sold the Louisiana Territory to America. And so, in a real sense, John Adams was the forgotten purchaser of the Louisiana Territory. During the debate over whether to go to war against France, Federalists raised the specter of internal subversion, that spies in the United States represented a threat as great as the threat posed by France. Federalists accused Democratic Republicans of disloyalty and conspiring with the French. The bitter political division led the Federalist-dominated Congress to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts that were designed to suppress France's supporters in the United States. It was also designed to destroy Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. The Alien and Sedition Acts empowered authorities to fine or imprison anyone who wrote, printed, or published any scandalous or malicious writings against the government of the United States. Now, that law clearly violated the First Amendment right to freedom of expression. It meant that anyone who criticized the president could be arrested. In fact, over a dozen pro-Republican newspaper editors were fined and arrested under the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so just as the founders feared, a combination of entanglement in European rivalries, foreign interference in US politics, and partisan factionalism was infringing on civil liberties at home. When Thomas Jefferson was elected president in 1800, he was determined to put an end to party factionalism. He wanted to restore America's sense of mission and its commitment to an isolationist foreign policy. And so his inaugural address in 1801 proclaimed, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," trying to unite the two parties. He referred to the American government as, quote, "the world's best hope and a chosen country." He prescribed honest friendship with all nations, but entangling alliances with none. But he would soon find it would be impossible for the United States to remain aloof from other countries. And that is where we will pick up next week. So again, I'm sorry for the technical difficulty. I'll make sure that that doesn't happen next week. But at this point, we can now turn to your questions or comments. And if you would indicate to Jerry that you have a question or comment, she will unmute your microphone so that you can ask those questions.
Let me go back to the full gallery view. I'm trying to get the gallery view up.
Okay, I have
There
it
it is. I got it. I got it.
Okay.
Okay. So I don't see anybody with questions and no chats. I guess you
Well,
covered it all.
Well, either that or I've confused everybody. That
So
So let me just reiterate. So this first lecture looks at the origins of isolationism, where it all began. Next week, we are going to see how the United States tried to follow an isolationist foreign policy in the 19th century, but at times that would prove to be impossible.